This episode of Cape Ann Today is brought to you by the Building Center, setting the standard for quality and service since 1903.
I am talking to Peter Phippen, a member of the Essex Board of Selectmen. Peter is a hydrogeologist and a coastal scientist with 40 years of experience in water resources management, including coastal coordinator for the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission and the Mass Bays Estuary Program. Peter understands how water moves. The town of Essex is about 16 square miles, and 2 of those miles are water. The town cradles a corner of the 24,000-acre Great Marsh. Anyone who has ever tried to drive over the Essex Causeway in a bad storm knows sea level rise and moving water is an issue for this little town. Peter, thank you for being with me.
Yes, well, thanks for having me. 40 years, wow, getting old.
Oh, that's nothing. That's nothing. Well, Peter, can you start off by telling us how to think about sea level rise in Essex? Do you think of this as inevitable and you're trying to figure out how to manage it when it happens? Or are you trying to prevent some of the impact of rising sea levels across the town now, or both?
We're actually both. It is inevitable, but we can try to stem it a little bit, or at least some of the damage that's caused by sea level rise and storm surge. But clearly you mentioned the Causeway, and that's sort of the poster child for Essex for what's going on with sea level rise and climate change there. And it's expands from there as well. I mean, a lot of the coastal areas are inundated. Not every storm, not every event, but certainly the big ones, even over at the golf course, that roadway goes completely underwater. It can actually look like the ocean from the golf course right there, with the golf course being in the middle of it. There's a lot of other roadways that go underwater as well. Apple Street, as a matter of fact, the town is engaged in an effort to try to raise the eastern end of Apple Street, because that actually went underwater in 2018, the storm, roughly 4 years ago, that series of storms that wreaked havoc on a lot of the coastal communities of Massachusetts.
And that's a river. There's a little river right there, right?
There's a little, it's a stream, and it's not really, it's the coastal impact that impacted it. It was the sea level that came up and flooded out the road, so that there was no access across town. You had to go all the way over to the northern end of Chabaco Lake, or even out to 128 to get from one side of town to the other, which is not a good situation for first responders and DPW activities during the storm event. So
wait, are you saying, because that end of Apple Street is nowhere near, as I imagine it, the sea? And so you're saying sea level rise came through that stream, it impacted that small stream and made the waters flood the street. Is that right?
It came up from the marsh side, and flooded out the street from that end. So, the water came up the Essex River over the Causeway, under the bridge, all the way back up into there, and flooded out the roadway at Apple Street. And
it's amazing.
And DPW could not get through there, and obviously can't have that situation. And that, it's only happened that one time. It got close. There was a storm not that long ago, but this is something that's going to happen more and more frequently. So, and it takes a long time to go through the permitting and the design and all that to raise a roadway like that. So we needed to start sooner rather than later, so that by the time we actually get construction activities going on, the road will be high enough and passable. And it's not like that's a great road for traffic or anything. If you've ever driven on it, it's more or less one lane.
Yeah, right.
But at least it is access for emergency vehicles and DPW.
So it's important to protect it for that purpose.
Definitely.
Right.
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, let's go back to the Causeway and the business district, as I understand it. What,
Sure,
and I know the state, I think, is redoing the bridge there, right? They're in charge
they
of
are.
that project. But what is the town, what's the town's thinking about the business district? And can it stay there? I mean, is there any conversation about it leaving? Because
Well,
it gets really wet.
yes, I mean, it's an issue, and it's hard to um, tell a business owner, hey, you're going to be flooded out in 10 years, 15 years, 25 years. You need to move. You need to think about what you're doing when, they can't even get, servers to come in to the restaurant, and stuff like that. So they're really sort of dealing day to day in that regard. And they understand that there's an issue there, obviously. But there's not a whole lot of options for them. And, the town has a strategic plan. I haven't looked at it lately, but I don't think it gets too far engaged. And it's just being updated now, so maybe it does, as to what should happen with that business district.
Mhm.
My personal thoughts, and these are just my personal thoughts, are that we could start to set aside, as part of a zoning effort, an area where businesses could move and still have water access, like a water street, or even along 133 someplace. I don't really haven't thought about it that intently, but I mean, you want to give the businesses sort of a similar environment that they have now,
Mm.
and have them come together as they do now, so that you have a center for the businesses. But it's not sustainable the way it is currently on the Causeway. I mean, it's going to be a matter of time. I mean, some businesses will start to leave sooner than others. Maybe some of them will raise up their buildings and last longer, but eventually it's not going to be sustainable. But I'm talking long term now,
Right.
2070, 2075, something like that.
Do you people ever look at other communities where sea level rise is really, a crisis situation?
Yeah, I mean, all the time. I mean, I've worked with the state on various projects and coastal projects, and there's a lot of places. As a matter of fact, I lived in the town of Situate for a number of years, many years ago, and that's sort of the poster child for climate change and sea level rise and storm surge and all that. And there's really nobody has found a solution, because it's off in the future. I mean, look at Plum Island. I mean, houses are still being built in places where other houses have gone into the water. But because it only happens right now infrequently, and people feel they can get away with it, and towns need the revenue, and so on and so forth. But there is, at this point, it's premature to look at the option of just moving people off the island, away from these flooded areas, because it's not severe enough. I mean, the people who own the properties really need to be the ones who make that final decision, at least the majority of them. There'll always be somebody that wants to stay right in the marsh, like, as I mentioned, in Situate, where there are houses on pilings. And when I was down there, it was just the pilings, they were up 20 feet, and that was to keep out of the storm waves. Now every single high tide goes under their house. So, and people want to still live there,
Yeah, that's amazing.
It is.
Well, how important is the Great Marsh for protecting the town of Essex?
Extremely important. And we have a team of people. We're blessed with a lot of nonprofits and educational establishments and such that are all interested in the Great Marsh and working to help restore and protect and even enhance the marsh. And, a healthy, functioning salt marsh is our best and probably most economic way to protect against sea level rise. I mean, if you can keep the marsh vegetation stable and vibrant, that's going to help buffer waves. You know, the dunes, keeping them stable as well is going to help. They're the first line of protection against the big waves and the big storms. So you want to keep the sand from eroding away. I mean, there's a lot of different things that are happening in the marsh to try to help protect it.
Could you sort of describe specifically how the marsh protects the town?
Well, obviously you have marsh vegetation, and that serves as sort of a drag on the waves and starts to break them down. So as the waves roll over the marsh, it breaks the waves down. But as the tides are even lower, the waves are hitting up against the marsh edge, the marsh bank, and that's stopping the waves as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the barrier beaches, the sand dunes are blocking waves as well. There's, you know, a lot of activities functioning together. I mean, they don't seem like much. You look at some of the marsh grasses out there and they're only a foot high or sometimes 2 feet high. Doesn't seem like that would do that much, but when you combine that with the dunes and the banks and the long scope of what a wave has to cross over, even during the winter time when the grasses are laying flat, they create a drag and impact the waves significantly. We recently did a study up in Newbury looking at just that to see how much of an impact it had, and it's fairly significant.
Well, you recently started a column in the Manchester Cricket, a great column specifically on the Great Marsh.
Yes.
And you identified pretty serious threats to the Great Marsh right now. Do you want to talk about those a little bit?
Yes. Can you refresh my memory?
Sure. Yeah. So the pooling that happens because of the old channels and.
Okay, I haven't I didn't realize that article was out yet. Yes, there's a lot of different things. What's happening, and we're seeing it really within the last 5 years, it's really become pretty stark. Sea level rise is starting to impact the marsh, and what's happening is water used to get up there maybe once a month during the tidal cycle, and it would above the marsh, and it would sit there and slowly drain off. Now it's getting up there much more frequently. It's not draining off. And what's happening is you have natural pools on the marsh that are now enlarging because there's more water in them. And when you enlarge those pools, you're killing off the vegetation that surrounds it, and it's becoming more water. What we do there is we just put a shallow ditch to the nearest creek or even mosquito ditch to help drain off some of that water to shrink the pool back down. But also we're finding smaller areas, maybe the size of your car or something like that, where the marsh is dying off because water is pooling there. It's not draining down into the peat. It's sitting there much longer. It's becoming anoxic, and you're losing the vegetation. And as I mentioned earlier, vegetation is pretty key to helping protect the marsh. And as you start to do that, you start to destabilize the marsh peat, and you're going to start to lose the marsh. Invasive species are a big problem. They destabilize the marsh as well. And I'm talking about Phragmites and pepperweed out in the open marsh. So we've been working a lot to try to mitigate and remove the invasive species. And what we find is that the native vegetation immediately comes right back in the next growing season because there's such a good seed bank out there in the marsh. Let's see some of the other issues that we're looking. Eelgrass is something that's been not in this in the Great Marsh in any great amount for nearly 100 years. There still is quite a bit down in the Annisquam and you know, that area of Gloucester, But it used to be all the way up into the Merrimack River and up into Salisbury, and that stabilizes bottom sediments. Eelgrass is a plant that grows subtidally and will stabilize the sediment, help keep the channel stabilized and keeps it from eroding away. And so we've been working to plant that as well.
So why did we start losing eelgrass 100 years ago?
Eelgrass is kind of a canary in the coal mine. It's sensitive to a lot of different stressors.
Mm-hmm.
And, as it was, pollutants were coming in, development was happening, that sort of thing. And it has something that's called the wasting disease, which is like for us a common cold.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if your immune system is fine, it doesn't bother you. But if your immune system is compromised, people die from the common cold.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened to eelgrass. It started getting so stressed that the wasting disease that would just pass through it naturally eventually caught up with it and took care of it as it became more and more impacted by human development.
Mm. Well, I have to ask, because years ago, you and I met on this committee. How are the green crabs in the Great Marsh right now? What's the update with them?
This past year, they've been pretty prolific. We stopped monitoring them. We had a pretty good handle on the data, but we decided last year, we'd heard from some of the clammers that see them and also trap them. The state has a program where they send money to marine fisheries, who gets money out to the communities, at least 4 or 5 of the local communities in the Great Marsh, to trap green crab. And we were hearing that they were pretty high numbers. So we went out and trapped, and we found that they were pretty big numbers again this year. They sort of wax and wane depending on what the winter season brings. If it's a really cold winter with a lot of ice in the water, then the green crabs are down. But I guess I don't recall, but winter of 2020 and 2021 was a little bit warmer. Yeah.
Right.
But they are up there this year, and we'll start trapping again just to keep a handle on what's happening. And we're starting to get a few of the towns to contribute funds into the effort along with the state. I know Essex last year contributed some funding. We're looking to contribute some more this year. Ipswich has for a number of years. Newbury, I believe, is looking at adding funding next year into the green crab trapping, as is the city of Gloucester. So there's an effort. It's something that you have to be kind of diligent on. I don't think we'll ever get rid of them, but I think that the trapping effort has been helping. And, obviously it's important for the clammers and the clam industry to keep the green crabs down as much as you can.
Mm-hmm. Well, in your article, you talked about the fact that there is both good news and bad news for the Great Marsh, and you kind of addressed the bad news. Do you want to just tell us about the good work that's happening there? You mentioned the nonprofits that are all involved, and then these towns that are contributing to the green crab effort. Do you want to just end on some good news in the work?
Sure, of course. We've put together a core group of sort of dedicated professionals that are working on various projects to restore the Great Marsh. UNH, Boston University, National Wildlife Federation, the Parker River National Wildlife Refuge, and others who have been very successful over the past dozen years or so at getting funding for doing restoration efforts in the Great Marsh and doing pilot projects to look at how to restore the marsh, what can be done, and that sort of thing. And so we've been working on a number of projects over the years, and we're getting closer and closer to doing things like thin layer placement of sediment, which is taking sediment from dredging operations and putting it onto the marsh in very thin layers, thin enough that the vegetation can grow through it, but it allows the marsh to build. or living shorelines to help protect the marsh edge so it's not eroding away. In some places along the Essex River, the marsh is eroding at up to 12 feet a year. So you can see that it doesn't take long before you've lost a lot of the marsh. So there's a lot of different research projects and things that are going on to help preserve the marsh.
Well, thank you for talking about all of this. I hope we can talk to you again as I don't know, the story evolves, and I think it
Sure.
really will. There's so much to say about sea level rise and trying to protect our communities. So I hope you'll come back again.
Of course I will. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.